Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy. I'm the clinical director and co-founder of Evoke Therapy Programs. So tonight's broadcast is a fairly narrow topic. It's about entitlement. It was one that was requested of me some time ago. I think it's one of those characteristics in children that we find difficult, find even off-putting. I think there's a lot of shame associated with it, both towards the child themselves, but also towards the parent. So I'm going to talk about entitlement today, and I'm going to try, as always, to talk about some underlying and counterintuitive ideas around entitlement. I think some of the simplistic ideas and solutions for it aren't all that they're cracked up to be. They're not the full picture. But again, they're intended to shame parents, to shame children into compliance. And one thing we know about shame is that it is a powerful shaper of behavior. Right? I joke about it in my new book that if some of the tools, some of the skills that I'm sharing in it don't work, and in terms of changing other people's behavior, then resorting to shame, fear, intimidation, and guilt are really powerful ways of shaping behavior. But of course, we know of the consequences of those emotionally and spiritually in the long run. So oftentimes I hear about children being spoiled. Again, this is more in the layperson community, but I've heard that term. We've all heard that term over the years, being self-centered, even narcissistic. Um, the first thing that I want to bring up tonight is something I've been talking about a lot lately, is the idea that when you filter phenomenon through a therapy lens, it really takes away the non-judgment. It removes the idea, the reference point of good and bad, right or wrong and evil, and turns it into fixed or broken or wounded. And so the idea of entitlement, the idea of entitled, is rarely a word that I'm going to use or think about when working with anybody. Now, I might use it if I'm being a little bit lazy and I'm trying to offer shorthand to somebody else to describe a certain type of behavior. But really, I don't think about children, I don't think about people as entitled. Again, that might be the way that they're presenting. That is the pattern of behavior as observed on the surface, but underneath that, there's a deep sense of inadequacy, a deep sense of fear and insecurity and a lack of safety, and an unawareness of the narcissistic wound that was in place that created this presentation, this way of asking for, of being hungry for, of expecting something of others without the requisite empathy. One thing to understand is that this phenomenon is developmentally appropriate in a lot of ways. I learned early on in my study, my formal study, that one of the mistakes we make, in fact, I remember a professor teaching this in one of my first courses. He said, almost all child abuse has an element in it of expecting something developmentally inappropriate of the child. And that's obvious in something like sexual abuse, but think about physical abuse or verbal abuse. In almost all cases, there's frustration that is present because the child is not living up to adult expectations. And one of my pet peeves in this world is thinking about children as small adults. I used to listen to a lot of sports talk radio and hear people talk about this idea in this generation that we reward children for participation and how inappropriate that is. And that is absolutely appropriate when you're trying to get children to take risks. In fact, the literature suggests that it's more appropriate than rewarding successes sometimes. You're rewarding effort in essence. When you reward young children, younger children for effort, for participation, you encourage something that's within inside of their control, and they can expand their exposure to things. So that's just one example of how we put a developmental lens on children that's not appropriate. And children are, by the nature of their brain development, that they lack an ability to see other people, to anticipate consequences, to practice reciprocity. This is not a blank check for for behavior without accountability. But again, we take away the judgment. I think one of the hardest things in the parent education, the relationship education that I talk about is you can still have strong, firm, clear boundaries without judgment. And for most of that's hard to do. Most of us find setting an assertive boundary more difficult unless we're filled with anger and frustration and maybe even some judgment. That motivates us enough to set a healthy boundary, but it's possible. And it's something worth practicing or striving for, to practice healthy boundaries without the judgment, without the shame involved in it. Limitations in self-care encourage children to consider the other. And this is what I mean by that. I actually wrote a blog about this, about how parents' limitations affect children. If parents were all capable, right? If they had virtually no limitations, then children wouldn't have to learn things like frustration tolerance, delay of gratification, right? Self-soothing. And they wouldn't have an experience of or a need to consider an other. That's very important. And instead of describing something in the child that's limited or broken or wrong with them, what we can do is simply own our own limitations. This is the extent of the patience. I can or can't do this. As simple as an exercise as last night. It was late at night. It had been a long day. We let my children are on spring break, and my youngest had stayed up past her typical bedtime. We indulged her, if you will, in allowing her to stay up late. And she came into our room and she said, "Will you put me to bed tonight?" And both my wife and I said, "We're just too tired." And I remember thinking, Brad, you should try harder. You should have enough energy. A better father would go put his daughter to bed. And I remember thinking about this podcast, this webinar, anticipating, and I thought, it's okay if I'm too tired. It's okay if I'm exhausted. And the important thing that we do, and this is true in a lot of parenting, is that we just own it. Because children can deal with human parents. What they can't deal with, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, they can't deal with parents as easily or as well, with parents who put their limitations or inadequacies on the child, make it the child's fault, being too needy. So our limitations, our self-care encourages the child to feel things and to deal with things and to consider an other. When we talk about the narcissistic wound, what is the narcissistic wound? The narcissistic wound is the wound of not being seen, of not being held, psychologically speaking. And so we all have some of it. Everybody has some narcissistic wound because nobody has a perfect parent. And so what happens when that happens, when we're wounded, when we're not seen is, and that's true of all of us to some extent, if it goes unprocessed, unhealed, then we try to compensate that in the relationship with our child. We overextend ourselves so as not to not see them, right? And also we look for them to see us. We actually look for children to see and reflect back a positive image of us. We're trying to ask our children to do something for us that our parents were supposed to do. And because our parents were human, they didn't do it perfectly. So really what's happening is we're passing on our narcissistic wound to our children. And it doesn't become diagnostically narcissism unless it reaches a pretty significant threshold. But all of us have some of that there. So our task as parents, and I talk about this all the time, our task becomes healing ourselves, healing our family of origin. And it's true that we all don't have big T trauma, but all of us have little T trauma. Somebody just asked the question, what's my definition of shame? I talk about this quite a bit. Shame is a visceral, powerful feeling of something's wrong with me. The energy in shame makes me want to hide, to cover myself up, to disappear, to not be present. It's a more intense version of guilt. Some people make the distinction that shame is feeling bad about who you are and guilt is feeling bad for what you do. I don't think of them as clearly as two different things. I think of shame a much more intense version of that feeling of not good enough. So gratitude, how to foster gratitude. Gratitude would be a characteristic that's the opposite of, the antithesis of entitlement. And the way to foster gratitude, again, to maintain a sense of self as a parent, to practice healthy self-care, to have appropriate boundaries, but really to allow somebody to feel everything. One of the biggest stumbling blocks for parents, I get asked this question all the time. How do I make sure that my child forgives me? Or how do I make sure my child moves through their resentment or anger for the decisions that I've made? And I'm going to say it very simply. The best way to help a child move through their feelings, the feelings that you would call negative feelings, is to allow them to feel it. The moment that we put energy into a child feeling something else is the moment we contribute to them getting stuck in an emotion. In other words, if I want you to not be angry at me, if I want my son, my daughter, or you to not be angry at me, and that energy comes out, whatever way that it comes out, and it comes out, then you're more likely, I'm contributing to a dynamic where you're going to stay angry as a matter of principle. So when we let go, when we are not attached to what our children are feeling, and that is a lifelong practice and pursuit. But as we approximate, get closer and closer to that ideal, we contribute to our children feeling everything and moving through it. See, the deal is with feelings, whether it's somebody trying to stop somebody from feeling something, or an individual, a child, trying not to feel something unpleasant, uncomfortable, painful. The problem with that is you don't just block, excuse me, you don't just block one feeling. You block all feelings. You can't cut off the bad feelings and just let the good feelings through. That's not how it works. Pain is the other side of the coin of love. Sadness is the other side of joy. And if you cut off the sadness, you cut off the joy. That is essentially what depression is. Now, we know there's a biochemical component to depression, but the experience of depression is a numbing of, a depression of feelings. So the best way to encourage gratitude is to allow a child to feel everything, to create as much space and capacity for the child to feel everything. I think that entitlement, and of course words like spoiled or selfish or self-centered, I think those are just simply terms that we use to shame children. We shame other people because it's easier to try to shame somebody into compliance, into something that we can more easily tolerate, so we don't have to set boundaries. I think it's mostly that issue. I don't want to admit that I have difficulty with boundaries. I don't want to admit that I lack the strength, fortitude, psychological wherewithal to set boundaries. That's hard. I have to admit, be vulnerable, admit a weakness in myself. And so instead of doing that, I'm going to make you the problem. I'm going to call you entitled or a narcissist or selfish or spoiled, inconsiderate. And my intention is, if I can get you to not push up against my boundaries, then I don't have to do the hard thing of managing, dealing with, fighting the battle of setting boundaries, and most difficultly owning it. So I think it's just about shame. Our responsibility is to respond again with patience, non-judgments, curiosity, and kindness. But what happens when we don't. And we all don't sometimes. We practice apologizing. We practice accountability. We model it. Parents sometimes worry about this. They worry that if they share their faults and their mistakes too much with their children, that their children will use that against them. Not if you do it assertively. If I apologize to you, I'm not excusing any behavior in you. I'm just owning my side of the street. If I'm doing my work, my acknowledgement of my limitations, my faults, my mistakes, ways that I've hurt you, don't come with strings attached. Don't allow you to use those as excuses. That's not what I'm talking about. But we're afraid because many of us were raised in families where there was this power struggle, this secret warfare of competition about who was the most right, who could be the least vulnerable, who could be the most powerful. And because we grew up in that soup, because it was less than ideal, we passed that characteristic, that dynamic, that culture along to our children. And so that's why I talk about all the time, getting good at losing, getting good at being wrong. Just the other night, I think I may have shared this recently. Just the other night, I finished writing in my book, and I was talking about apologizing to children. It so happens that I did something not so kind to my 11-year-old, and I felt absolutely righteously justified. And I sat on the couch saying, we were home alone, me and my 11-year-old, and I'm saying, I'm not going to apologize to her. Of course, then I reflected on the book and thought what an imposter I was. And I stood up after a few moments of sulking and I went over to my daughter and I said, I'm sorry. And then I wanted her to forgive me. And she said, I don't want to talk about it. And I considered pushing it because I wanted to be forgiven. And then I said, you're right. You don't have to talk about it. You get to be mad. You get to have this boundary. And I'm not going to force it. So we apologize when we make the mistake and we try to own it as much as possible. We try to focus on, to work on our side of the street. Boundaries are the most important work that we do because boundaries are evidence of a strong sense of self and our awareness of what it means to be connected to another human being. And so many of us had modeled in our lives a kind of distorted way of understanding closeness and connection. We were taught that it was consensus, that it was agreement, that it was everybody feeling and thinking the same way, that it was people being happy with each other, right? And we didn't know that it was difficult and painful and guilt-provoking to work on, establish, and practice boundaries. And so, we didn't come with a model. We didn't come with a pattern. And so we engage relationships in similar psychological proximity. I'm going to say that again. We engage relationships in similar proximal distances with other people. We follow through and model the way that we were taught. When I tried to force my 11-year-old the other night to forgive me and to talk about it, that's what I mean. That was me saying, I can't sit with the anxiety of you being upset with me. First, I had to come to terms with the fact that I messed up and apologize. So I should be rewarded for that. And you should apologize. And she was right and I was wrong. It was her boundary. And it would have been an abuse of power for me to force her to let down the wall that she just put up because I hurt her, because I was short with her. We learn in Al-Anon to take care of our side of the street. This goes back to the idea of shaming messages to children. One of my least favorite words that people call anybody is selfish. I haven't said this in a long time, but when that was used in my group, I would say to my students, I'm not even sure what that means, selfish, because there's nothing I'm teaching you, there's nothing we're talking about that I'm not sharing with you that I don't want to benefit you for the rest of your life. Even if it's service to other people. The reason I would be teaching you service to other people is because it brings you a greater sense of meaning and connection, of empathy and of love. So there's nothing in any of this work that I believe in or teach or encourage that doesn't help you. But again, selfish is this idea that is used by authority figures to try to get people around them to comply with things so they don't have to work on boundaries. We take care of our side of the street. We take care of our piece of it. Our wounds and our how stuff or praise becomes a substitute for connection. So stuff, praise is tricky because it can easily be misunderstood as love and affection. And then what happens for the child is they experience objectification, being turned into an object. That's what that means. And so if you try to compensate with hurts, with time and attention and resonance, with gifts and things, I see parents try to do that sometime at Evoke, right? They try to make up for the boundary that they set. Try to manipulate the child's feelings with stuff. Or sometimes parents do it with praise. If I can praise you into a sense of feeling better, I can create more cohesion, more affection between the two of us. But those two things have nothing to do with connection, nothing to do with intimacy. And if they get confused for intimacy, we all can guess what's going to happen in an individual life. They're going to have problems in relationships, misinterpreting people. Now, I want to say one thing because it did just hit my ear, which is families that have very few resources, children do see things as love, and that can be appropriate because in families where there are very few financial resources, very little stuff, then it's a great sacrifice. But middle income families and above, there's this false sense that stuff can make up for things. And we know in those situations that people are giving us stuff and praising us to try to manipulate how we feel. Seeing our children and their needs instead of getting ours met. It's an irony, but I'll say it this way. Your children need you to take care of yourself. Somebody said to me one time, a professional said to me, the world is a better place when Brad Reedy takes care of himself. And this was a close friend of mine who knew that I was burning the candle at both ends. And that if I didn't take care of this, I wasn't going to last long. I wasn't going to be good for anybody else. And whatever I had to offer and to give to the world was going to be snuffed out through burnout or resentment or having a short life because of the stress that I put on my body. It's hard. It's something that your parents, it wasn't their fault. They didn't know better. But they made you feel guilty, and not just them, but other authority figures, peers, the culture. They all made you feel guilty for taking care of yourself. And it's a worthy battle to fight. Back to the question that somebody asked a while ago about shame. I say this all the time. Guilt is not a reliable source of conscience of right or wrong. And in order to do good and to grow morally, to become more loving, more capable, more powerful, a better friend, a better father, a better mother, a better sister, brother, we have to do battle with guilt. We have to learn to tolerate guilt and to pick apart the messages in our guilt that were given to us by the culture, by our earliest contexts. So we have to take care of ourselves. If we don't, we end up feeling resentful, angry, and blaming the other person with words like entitlement, selfish, spoiled. This idea of needing from our children, I mentioned this earlier, needing from our children what we didn't get from our parents. Right? The idea was the parents were supposed to be an adequate container. That's simply a psychological term for holding us with compassion, non-judgment, love, patience, curiosity. To the extent that they failed in that, they left a wound, like I described earlier. And so we think about our children like it's our children's job to love us, like it's our children's job to forgive us, like it's our children's job to think that we're great dads, great mom. That's not their job. That naturally comes for many children, but it's not their job. And when that becomes their job, when we enlist them at that job, we really start to affect child development negatively. The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller, both the podcast that I did and the book, are a great source if you want to learn more about that. We have to learn to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, our children are going to be inclined to do it for us at the cost of their real and authentic selves, which will then affect them in their peer relationships, which we will look at and very clearly see problems in. But those problems began and were patterned in their relationship with us. Taking care of yourself is a worthy, important, critical, and fundamental task in creating children that can take care of themselves and that feel okay about themselves. What is underneath? I recently had somebody ask me the question of, a professional asked me the question, what do I say to a codependent mom when she says to me, if I kick my son out of the house, he could die? And my first response is, first of all, you don't ever tell a mom to kick the kid out of the house. It's not your job. In fact, it's against the ethical code of most licensing for therapists to advise important life decisions, life-threatening decisions like that, when life and death are on the line. So we don't do that. What we do is we teach that mom how to have a different kind of relationship with her son. We teach her, we work with her to help her to have a more intimate, differentiated, healthy relationship with her son. Out of that, she gets the clarity to make the decision she needs to. The answer isn't in kicking your son or daughter out of the house. The answer is not in leaving him, letting him back in the house over and over again. Those are not solutions. That's not the way we therapists think about things, at least the ones who have done our work. We think about facilitating a transformation of sensibilities so that people can understand and experience a different quality of a relationship with another person. Then out of that awareness, out of that truth, if you will, comes their decision. And that decision was and the wisdom that is associated with that decision was buried beneath shame and shoulds and shouldn'ts, cultural, societal, parental expectations. But once we help them unbury their authentic self, then they can make a decision. And they're going to have to live with it, because when life and death is on the line, and it is with some of our children, no parent can abdicate that responsibility to a professional, and no professional ideally would take that on. Indulgence doesn't explain it. I think this is just parent shaming. People who want to shame parents because they have quote unquote entitled children start to come up with derogatory terms to describe parents. Helicopter parenting, even enmesh parenting, codependency. Codependent can be a shaming term for some people. And so it's just a way for professionals, for culture to try to punish you and your woundedness. Let's say you're codependent, and we all are to some extent. So you're codependent. All that is a label for a term, a description of a personality characteristic that is born out of a childhood wound. So I insult you, so you stop doing it? You see the craziness, the insanity of it all? Hopefully one of the things that comes out of this process for all the families that we work with is that we become less judgmental of everybody and ourselves. And concurrently, we get better and better at living our authentic truth and setting a boundary. I want to describe projective identification because it's a powerful concept that I've shared before. Projective identification is taking the feeling out of me, right? That feeling of inadequacy or insecurity or not enoughness, if you will. And instead of feeling with, working on, dealing with that, I put something in you. I put that in you. I criticize you. I tell you that you're not enough or that you're too much or this is what's wrong with you. So I've taken the bad feeling out of me. I've put it in you. And then you feel what I feel. So it's a lot easier, right? That's where we talk about the identified patient. And that's where hopefully at Evoke you get the support and encouragement and empowerment and love and compassion to start to heal everybody. But what happens if we don't have all of that is we just talk about the problems in the child instead of beginning to understand what are the dynamics at play here. What are my wounds? What's my ghosts, my demons, my dragons, my mother, my father, my peer group growing up, my school, my teachers? How do all those messages affect me in such a way that I'm compromised? And then the way that I'm compromised contributes to my child being compromised. And can I look at that? Do I have the courage? Do I have a safe enough place to look at that? So when we struggle with boundaries, it's one of the most common projective identifications actually in any relationship. And I've done it all the time. I do all this stuff. That's how I know about it. When we fail to set boundaries with other people, we love to blame them and call them names and point out how they turned out. It's like when a parent says to me, my child is manipulative. My thought is, that's as much of a confession of a contribution to a dynamic as it is an accusation or indictment on him or her. See, this process, if we allow it to sink in, and it's not shaming and it's not blaming, and there's accountability and there's growth, and this is the only way to make a difference in our children's lives in deep and profound and lasting ways. If we can take the stuff back in and work on it. If the problem stops being out there, but rather in here, we can make a difference. It's too simple. It's too easy. It's why it sells, actually. It's why it's popular. To think of the problem as out there. And our children are helpless and unwittingly volunteer to be the identified patient, to be the problem. And they do enough stupid stuff that we can hang our projective identification hat on them and easily point out how ridiculous they're being. Really, we work to heal the narcissistically wounded parent. The level to which you work out whatever dilemma you have. Doesn't matter what it is, and they're all in some ways different and they're all in some ways similar. If that becomes your project, healing your own narcissistic wounds, you can make a more significant contribution in your relationships, particularly your children. And our unprocessed and unhealed trauma is the stuff that gets in the way of it. There's a quote, I don't remember it perfectly, but it was something similar to the idea that if we don't look around, if we don't see the devils running around inside of us, they're going to show up in the garden of our children. It's not a perfect quote, but it's something like that. Our children are just manifesting in various complicated, subtle ways, like a dream that we have at night that doesn't make any sense. They're just manifesting issues that they're trying to say to us, hey, this thing that we're doing as a family, that you're doing as a father and a mother, doesn't work for me. You're going to have to go somewhere. You're going to have to get me somewhere. We're going to have to get somewhere where we start to work on this. Our inability to see our children is because of our own woundedness. So what are the take-homes? Do your own family of origin work. I don't know of something that you could do. Just think about this term. This is everybody that I know believes this, by the way, that works in this field. They don't know how to say it, or they haven't done enough of it themselves that they can say it without judgment. It sounds like it's condescending. The best thing you can do to help your child is to do your own family of origin work. Come to an intensive. Wilderness therapy is a fantastic intervention. It's the most powerful intervention I've ever seen for young people. 8 weeks in wilderness feels like 8 months at other treatment settings, outpatient, intensive outpatient settings. Many people say that, can attest to that. In my experience, 1 hour of parent work is worth 5 hours of work with the children. A 4 or 5 day intensive with us, or with On-Site in Tennessee, or with Judy Crane in Florida, or with the Meadows Survivor Program in Arizona, or with the Bridge to Recovery in Bowling Green, Kentucky, on and on and on. A week there is worth 6 months of therapy with your child. So, and I say this, I can sell it because I do it. I do my own work. I go to my own intensive work. I work on my family of origin stuff. So working on your family of origin work, there's nothing that you can do that's more fundamentally powerful to help your child than for you to work on your family of origin work. If you don't know what it is, email me and I'll give you an idea. Work on yourself in order to understand the other, right? We know that from attachment literature. We know that from Daniel Siegel, Parenting from the Inside Out. The more clearly you can make sense of your own life, the connections, understand and create depth to your own traumatic past, no matter how mild or how severe it is, the more you can see and respond to the needs of the other. And it's an ongoing project, by the way. It's not just a one-stop situation. Look at the intent of, instead of the what you're doing. I teach this to our therapists. I talk about this with the families that I work with. It's not what you're doing that makes the big difference. It's why you're doing it, because that is affecting everything. Stop the pattern of shaming. Stop the pattern of shaming you guys, of me as a father, as a therapist, of children for their wounds. Just imagine instead of thinking about things as good and evil, if we thought about things through the mental health lens of healed or wounded, of broken or functioning. Imagine the difference that the world would experience and the people in it. Work with professionals and others to help you as you go along. That's simple, right? We all need help. If you don't think you need some kind of help, that's probably one of the biggest signs that you need help. And if you know that you need help, you still need help too, but just not as much as if you imagined that you didn't need it. Separating our symptoms from our wounds, right? Not reducing children and behaviors to the problem. We pay attention to that. We help with that because some of those are really, they're real big problems. But we try to also listen to what they're saying so that we understand where the real healing needs to happen. Symptoms can show us where the wounds are. They can help us to find the person. They're just, diagnoses are just the way that we organize our defenses. They're the pattern, the style that we prefer. Substance abuse disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, eating disorders. This is the style of self-medicating that we prefer, that we're inclined to. Sometimes you can see a lot with your children. I call it having x-ray vision. But it's really important that you not use it insensitively, that you still allow children to have their dignity. You let it inform you, but confronting the defenses, I do it all the time. I was just sharing a story with somebody today about my wife. She walked into that office door in my office on a Saturday. Something had happened, she was upset, and I was the punching bag. And in my absolute genius, I pointed out to her in her upset state, her vulnerable state, that she was using projective identification to try to make me feel the feelings that she was feeling, that I was the problem, but it was really her sense of inadequacy. You can guess how that went. In the history of pointing out somebody's defense in the middle of a compromised, escalated, anxious, upset place, there's almost never been a success that the person says, you know what, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. So we learn to honor, to see the defenses, to learn from them. All right, there are some questions that have come in. I'll go to those first, and then I will go to any upcoming questions after the announcements. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I apologize. I already did that one. I don't have a moderator, so I'm just going to read right here. Let me clear the chat. No, I'm afraid I'm going to mess that up. I apologize. Okay, I'm sorry if I've exposed some first names there. I apologize. Actually, I have to do this. You're going to have to submit your questions because I'm afraid that I did that. So I'm going to clear the chat history, and you may have to enter. Nope. Okay. I apologize, without a moderator tonight. How much does parent peer pressure contribute to judgment and shaming of our children? I live in an affluent community where parent criticism of other people's children is epidemic. I look back in situations where I felt shame about my own child's behavior in response to gossip and criticism. I think it's prolific. I think it's a huge problem. And what I'm most upset about is that it's a problem. It's a problem even in the mental health and addiction community. That therapists and treatment professionals shame parents all the time, blame them. Now, I'll talk about dynamics and contributions, but there's no shame layer on top of it. It's just like, hey, we're all in this together. We're all human. So I think it's a profound thing in our communities, and even in the mental health field, it's profound. Another parent asked, what happens when, as a parent, I did nothing other than ask for my adult son to do a simple household chore, and I met with a refusal and rage as a reply? He doubles down with an email lecture, being a victim, and blamed me for his reaction, taking zero responsibility to stay on topic. Yeah, that example is you didn't do anything off base, but something in his life has been off, right? Maybe you, maybe the culture, maybe the other parent. There's something broken in him. That rage is covering up fear and insecurity and inadequacy and shame, right? That's what's happening. So yes, in that example, there's no mistake, there's no error. But if I'm treating him, I'm trying to figure out, why did you respond to rage at a simple request? And the answer would be, if we could work together, inadequacy, shame, embarrassment, fear, sadness, insecurity, right? So that's where it comes from. And still it requires of you, and that's a tough situation when we're in it, it still requires of you to set the boundary and say, I won't take on the rage. And that's really, really, really tough and hard work to do. You need support for that. Our son often says things that indicate to us he has gratitude. It feels really nice, but how can it be determined if the words have feet? The way that I would say it is, just pay less attention to it. Don't get attached to gratitude and happiness any more than you would sadness and pain and ungratitude, right? I think to see if something has legs or feet, you take a step back and you think, we'll see. When I think about, especially with young people, when I think about them telling us things that we want to hear, I always wonder, are they trying to sell me something, right? It's probably just a curse of the job. And so I just learned to take a step back. I can remember when my son was a young teenager, before he got sober, walking into his middle school, drunk on the bathroom floor, standing next to the vice principal, while my son told me what a great father I was and how glad that I was in his life and that we were going to get through this together. And because of my background and treatment and experience, he was so lucky. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, he's drunk. And second of all, I'm thinking, this is nonsense, right? I didn't say anything. And you can't reason with a drunk. And I mean, you can't reason with a literal drunk, and you can't also reason with somebody that doesn't have the full capacity to reason. So just hold on to their gratitude and happiness as lightly as you would hold on to their pain and ingratitude and rage. I find that there are layers of healing, then more layers when doing family of origin work. Currently looking into doing another intensive. Thank you for mentioning that the work is not one and done. How can we determine? I already answered that question. What is your definition of narcissism? You can look that up. There's 9 characteristics, and I think you have to qualify for five of them. Narcissism can be inflated and arrogant looking, but it also can be depressed. The person who thinks that everything is about them and they're the cause of all the problems. But it's this delusional sense that one creates in one's mind because one experiences this idea of a lack of resonance. And so to feel safe, they create this delusional idea about themselves and how they are in the world. Oftentimes it's inflated, and so I make up ideas about myself. I talk about, I actually did a blog called What Really is Narcissism? So Google What Really is Narcissism and my name, Brad Reedy. And I say, it's not valuing a child, or excuse me, it's not overvaluing a child. And that's what most people shame parents into believing. It's valuing the wrong things in a child. What they do, what they say, how smart they are, how pretty they are, how strong they are, how fast they are when they run, things like that. So it's a misalignment where then a child develops a delusional world and places themselves in it in such a way that they have grandeur, they have grandiose ideas about themselves, or it's a depressed state where they feel like everything is their fault, it's their problem. But that's different than the narcissistic wound that we all have some experience with. I feel I fall into being my son's therapist when I understand him to be to this level, which I do easily. This doesn't seem good for him or me. It's better than blame, judgment, etc., but I'm not sure that it's good. I'm glad you said that. My 11-year-old said tonight she's the only one that's not in regular therapy. She said she wanted to go back to therapy. And now she wants to be a therapist. She said she likes her therapist. She said her therapist doesn't get mad when she makes a mess. Might give you some idea of the difficulties with OCD we have in our home. But I'm not their therapist. And a good therapist keeps their mouth shut when they see things, right? They don't they don't point out defenses. They discover wounds and they understand and they empathize. Most people think that a good therapist calls somebody on their crap. That's just a bad therapist or a cruel person, right? Instead, you try to understand somebody. That's the healing nature of things. That's what my therapist does with me. I come in sharing some story about something stupid I did, and I've learned now that the project is she helped me understand what I was feeling underneath it. And because it's a safe place to explore, I realize what's at the core of it. It's not that hard to point out something stupid, irrational, unhealthy that somebody does. That's easy work, really. That's second semester graduate school work. The hard thing is having the capacity to look and find and be curious about the wound that lies beneath everything. I struggle with boundaries. I want to give frequent advice that will help my son to avoid situations that will lead to his feeling ashamed. Is this unsolicited advice still a boundary violation, even when it's in the service of making a life mistake that will lead to a heavy load of shame? It's a great question and a great way that you worded it. It absolutely is a boundary violation. You know, if you have an understanding with your son that he wants advice all the time, but I suspect that you probably get signals from him that he doesn't want it. But it's invasive. It is psychologically incestuous, right? And it might serve in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't respect the sovereignty of a self. right? The boundaries around the other person. They're not getting to choose. All right. If you wanted to do more and you don't want to spend any more money, go to 12-step meetings. Al-Anon, Code of Families Anonymous, Al-Anon for teens. They have it's Alateen or Adult Children of Alcoholics. If you grew up in an especially cold, abusive, alcoholic home, adultchildren.org is a great place to go. Also, refugerecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired 12-step recovery program that doesn't emphasize a higher power as much. Mommy.org is a place that you can go to get classes and information that are affordable in your area. Follow all these broadcasts on your podcast app. I would also solicit that you give podcast reviews and ratings. When you go to the podcast app on your iPhone, go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. On your Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs there, or you can just go to soundcloud.com and search Evoke Therapy Programs there. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy, and also you can follow our new Summit Lodge Instagram account at Evoke Summit Lodge. Find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also find the Alumni Foundation, which helps people that can't afford treatment by going to Facebook and searching Evoke Family Foundation. The blog, the Evoke Therapy blog, has new content each week. My book is available audio, also Kindle, or if you want to buy a paperback version right now, the warehouse is sold out, and you can go to the new option underneath the paperback option and buy directly from Evoke Therapy Programs. The next intensive, if you want to do deep work, we still do have some spots in our March intensive. The next finding is March 27th through 31st. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. I will be in New York this Monday evening, 7 to 9 p.m. Hope to see you all there. And then tentatively Philadelphia on Monday, March 8th. I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. And then pretty sure also in Toronto, I'll be there Wednesday, May 22nd. Email melanie@evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. If you want to do a multi-family workshop experiential with our staff, psychoeducational, the next one that's available is March 23rd through 24th. We ask all parents who are current parents of a student or a client at Evoke to attend one. Again, contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com. If you want to learn more about our intensive trips around the world, go to our website and look at our Pursuits program. Are there any other questions? Sorry about not having a moderator tonight and any confusion that caused. We'll try to fix that. Looks like there are no other questions. Thank you for joining us. I'll be back on this Thursday evening, March 14th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time with a new topic for you. We'll send out that announcement tomorrow morning via email, so look for that. Look forward to that. Thanks for joining me tonight. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for your patience. And I hope this is a helpful point of contact to all of you. And I hope you feel empowered and supported and not judged by the process, but you know that we're all in this together. Take care, folks. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.